Joining me right now in a Fox Business exclusive is Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas CEO and President Robert Kaplan. Sir, good to have you on the program. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good to see you, Maria.
Well, we've been counting on you and your colleagues for so many years now, providing stimulus to this economy. Now it looks like we're getting fiscal stimulus coming out of Washington. What are your thoughts on this tax plan when it comes to the deficit and growth?
Well, I'll be careful not to get in the middle of the tax debate and the political elements, but I think that our economy, the U.S. economy, is approaching full employment. And while the headline unemployment rate's 4.1%, the measure I look at most significantly, unemployed plus discouraged workers plus people working part-time for economic reasons, even that's approaching pre-recession lows. So that's the context. And I've said up to now, I think regulatory review, tax reform, if the reform elements of it, corporate tax reform could be helpful if it encourages companies to locate plants here, invest more. The thing I'd be sensitive to is I've also been saying and been very vocal that government debt to GDP is at historically high and likely unsustainable levels, particularly when you look at the $49 trillion of unfunded entitlements. And so I think we've got to be very careful not to do things that increase debt to GDP and the deficit, because I think it's already at unsustainable levels.
Yeah, you make all good points, but you did say that the economy basically is getting better. I mean, you look at the unemployment story.
Yeah.
That's certainly improved. You just mentioned that. You've got 2 quarters now of 3% growth, which obviously is a good thing. Is that one of the reasons that recently you said you are now actively considering hiking interest rates, another interest rate increase?
So our GDP forecast for this year, by the way, at the Dallas Fed's about 2.5%. And so sluggish by historical standards, but certainly enough to continue to take slack out of the labor market. And the reason I've said that I'm actively considering next steps is we are at or near full employment. And my own projection, our projection at the Dallas Fed, is we're likely to overshoot maximum sustainable employment. So even though we have been slow to meet our inflation target, I think the amount of the overshoot is something I need to take into account in thinking about removing accommodation. And so that's something I'll be looking at, the degree of the overshoot and imbalances that can be created because of it.
So where have we seen inflation at this point?
Well, so here's what's going on, I think, on inflation. Part of what's going on is because we're taking slack out of the labor market, we're getting toward full employment. You do have cyclical pressures. We haven't seen it show up in wages or prices, in my opinion, because we've got a very strong structural headwind, and that's primarily what I call technology-enabled disruption and to some extent globalization, but mainly disruption. What do I mean by that? Technology replacing people, consumers able to use technology to shop for lower prices, taking away pricing power of businesses. And the other thing going on is if you've got a college education, you're able to adjust to this trend. If you've got a high school education, though, or less, unless you get retrained, you're finding your job either restructured or eliminated, and you probably don't have a lot of negotiating power in wages. And so this structural headwind, I think, is offsetting some of the cyclical forces, and I believe that's the reason inflation's been muted. And I think these structural headwinds are accelerating, and while cyclical forces are building, these structural headwinds aren't going away. So I think it's having a muting effect on inflation.
You make such an important point, I think, because we're all talking about technology and the fact that robotics is taking over, right? I mean, it's just a different skill set that is required to thrive in this economy. What do you say about that? I mean, in the next 10 years, are we going to have robots taking over many of our jobs?
The short answer is yes, we will. Now, we can still have full employment with that, but the thing that has to happen, we've got to improve early childhood literacy, college readiness. Half of all students going to college are not even graduating in 6 years. And that's key to being able to adapt in this kind of economy. And we've got to have more what we call middle skills training. 45% of all new jobs are middle skills, but they require a lot more training. Automotive technicians, pipe fitters, IT specialists, registered nurses. We can do this, but we've got to really beef up partnerships between businesses and junior colleges and high schools to train people for these middle skills jobs. They are middle class. They pay a lot of money, and we are lagging in creating the ecosystem where people can get better educated. So I think education and improving skills of our labor force got to be priority number one for us to deal with this trend.
This is a really important point that you're making, because our viewers want to know what they need, what skill sets they need to thrive, not just survive, in the next 10, 20 years. So you're saying 45% of new jobs are this middle skills area. What are those jobs?
Yeah. So what example, and by
skills.
the way, you know there's a so-called, you've heard the term, there's a skills gap in the United States. And what do I mean by that? Half of all small businesses say in surveys they cannot fill their skilled job openings. So again, examples, pipe fitters, automotive technicians, healthcare IT specialists, I mentioned, but there's a list of 20 of these, and a lot of them these kind of jobs didn't even exist. So 20 years ago, an automotive person needed less training. Cars were not so sophisticated. The salesperson in a car dealership was the key person, made probably the most money, and that's who you dealt with when you bought a car. Today, cars are bought online. The salesperson's job is a lot less important. You probably don't even deal with a salesperson anymore. Automotive technician today is the highest paid person in a car dealership, probably making $150,000, $175,000 a year. Most people aren't aware of this, and we don't have enough of them. And junior colleges around the country are partnering, including in Dallas here, are partnering with businesses to train more of them because we don't have enough of them.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I was talking to an auto technician, and this was a couple of years ago. She said to me, Maria, you can eat on the floor in my auto store because it's all technology.
Right.
There's no grease around. This is not what it was years ago, because in the car, everything's technology based. And so you really need that skill set.
That's right.
But let me ask you about the idea that we could get up to 4% growth. Do you think as things are getting better and we see this tax plan come out and that impacts people having more money in their pocket, could we actually see a 4% number over the near term?
Well, let me explain it this way. So what drives growth? Two things. Growth in the GDP is made up of growth in the workforce and growth in their productivity. And one of the problems we have in this country, which probably isn't talked enough about, the population is aging, workforce growth is slowing. Okay, the participation rate was 66% in 07. It's 63 today. We think at the Dallas Fed the bulk of that decline is demographic. It's aging, and it gets worse over the next 10 years. It's going to go to 61. So number one, we got to find ways to grow the workforce. That could be people working longer. The second thing, though, on this productivity issue we were just talking about, we've got people in their careers. If you've got a high school education or less, your productivity during your career may be going from here to here. Why? Because your job's getting restructured and we're not beefed up for the retraining. So in order to grow faster, we've got to grow the workforce and we've got to improve their productivity. And yes, these other things we're talking about will help, but I want to make sure we keep our eye on the ball. Those are the two things that drive GDP growth, and we need to beef up both of them.